This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Halloween Podcast. I am your host, Lyle Perez, and you're listening to episode 11 of our special series, The Dark Record, where we uncover history's eeriest stories, one strange and unsettling case at a time. Tonight, we return to a story we touched on briefly when exploring tales of time slips. But this time, we'll take a deeper dive into one of the most famous accounts ever recorded. The year is 1901, the setting is France, and two English women set out for what should have been nothing more than a pleasant stroll through the gardens of Versailles. Instead, they walked into an experience so strange that they became convinced they had stepped into another century. The next entry into the Dark Record, the Moberly Jourdain time slip. Let's begin. To understand why this strange incident captured so much attention, we first need to know who these two women were and what brought them to Versailles in the summer of 1901. Charlotte Ann Moberly was born in 1846 into a well-connected English family. Her father had been the headmaster of Winchester College and later the Bishop of Salisbury, placing her firmly within England's intellectual and social elite. By the turn of the century, she had carved out her own career as the first principal of St. Hugh's College, Oxford, one of the few institutions dedicated to educating women at a time when higher education for women was still controversial. She was thoughtful, serious-minded, and respected. Eleanor Jourdain, her companion on that fateful trip, was of a similar background. Born in 1863, she was an author, teacher, and lecturer, known for her discipline and sharp intellect. She would eventually succeed Moberly as principal of St. Hugh's. In 1901, though, she was still building her reputation, having recently written textbooks on French language and literature. Both women were academics in every sense of the word, rooted in scholarship, skeptical of frivolity, and protective of their professional standing. That makes what follows even harder to dismiss. These were not eccentric wanderers or spiritualists chasing ghost stories. They were middle-aged, educated English women, known in their circles for seriousness and restraint. Yet what they experienced during a simple afternoon walk through the grounds of Versailles would leave them questioning their own senses, and eventually the very nature of time itself. Versailles in 1901 was already a place heavy with history. The palace and its sprawling gardens had once been the symbol of French royal power, a glittering monument to kings and queens, most famously Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. By the early 20th century, it had become a tourist destination, drawing visitors from across Europe who wanted to glimpse the grandeur of the Ancien Regime. The Petit Trianon, a smaller estate within the grounds, was especially tied to Marie Antoinette, who had used it as a private retreat away from the rigid formalities of court life. For many visitors, walking the gardens was like stepping back into another world, rich with echoes of the past. It was here, under a bright August sky, that Moberly and Jourdain began their stroll. They expected nothing more than an afternoon of sightseeing, perhaps sketching or note-taking as they explored the gardens. But as they walked deeper into the grounds, something shifted. The light seemed to dull, the air grew heavy, and the lively atmosphere of a tourist attraction gave way to something still and uncanny. Without realizing it, they were crossing an invisible threshold, moving into an experience that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As Moberly and Jourdain made their way through the gardens of Versailles that August afternoon, they began to sense something was wrong. The path they followed should have been lively with other visitors, the air filled with chatter and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Instead, they later described a strange heaviness descending over them, as though the world had gone quiet. The bright summer sunlight dimmed, not in the way of clouds passing overhead, but in a manner that felt unnatural, as if the colors themselves had dulled. It was in this altered atmosphere that they first noticed the figures. Near one of the garden buildings stood two men, dressed in what seemed to be old-fashioned uniforms, dark coats, tricorn-style hats, and breeches that no one in 1901 would have worn. They carried themselves stiffly, like soldiers on duty. The women assumed at first they might be caretakers or reenactors, but something about their presence was unsettling. They looked less like modern men in costume and more like characters who had stepped straight out of another age. A little farther along, they encountered another man. This one wore a long cloak and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Both women later recalled his expression as sinister, even cruel. He stood watching them in silence, and the encounter left them deeply uneasy. Jourdain would later say that his presence filled her with dread, as though they had walked into a painting where every detail carried hidden menace. The most vivid moment came near the Petit Trianon itself. As they approached the small estate, Moberly saw a woman seated on the grass, sketching. She wore a pale dress with a wide sash, the style distinctly 18th century. A large hat shaded her face, but Moberly noticed sharp features and an air of melancholy. The image lodged itself in her memory. Later, when she thought back on it, she was convinced she had seen not an anonymous woman, but Marie Antoinette herself, captured in a moment of quiet just years before the revolution would sweep her to a violent end. Jourdain did not see the same woman, but she confirmed the eerie atmosphere and the strangeness of the figures they passed. Both women agreed the gardens no longer felt like the Versailles of 1901. The stillness, the muted light, and the way the strangers appeared and disappeared left them with the sense that they were not simply out of place, but out of time. By the time they left the grounds, they were shaken. The walk that should have been a pleasant afternoon diversion had become an experience they could neither explain nor forget. They had stepped into the gardens of Versailles expecting to see history preserved. Instead, they felt as though they had crossed into history itself.
When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like aloe or skins, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and brilliant marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify. With Shop Pay, that boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts are going abandoned and way more sales happening. So if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell whatever your customers are scrolling or strolling on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Skins uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/Westwood1, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/Westwood1 to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/Westwood1.
In the days immediately following their walk through the Versailles gardens, both Moberly and Jourdain tried to set the unsettling experience aside. They were, after all, on holiday, and neither wanted to dwell on something that might be dismissed as a trick of light or an overactive imagination. Yet the memory refused to fade. Moberly, in particular, felt haunted by the image of the sketching woman she had seen near the Petit Trianon. Her sharp features and peculiar presence were unlike any tourist or passerby she had ever encountered. The more she thought about it, the more she became convinced that she had seen none other than Marie Antoinette herself. At first, Jourdain resisted this conclusion. She was the more skeptical of the two, and in her mind, the experience might have been unusual but not supernatural. Still, she could not ignore her own sense of unease. The atmosphere that day had been heavy, oppressive, and deeply strange, and the figures they saw were not dressed as ordinary visitors of 1901. Gradually, the women began to discuss the event more openly with each other, comparing notes and realizing how strongly the memory had imprinted on them both. For nearly a week, they kept their impressions private, but in time, they came to an agreement. Whatever had happened at Versailles was worth recording. They began to write down the details while they were still fresh, creating sketches of the paths they had taken, noting the locations of the figures they had seen, and describing the shift in atmosphere that had unsettled them so profoundly. These private notes would grow into a document that both women returned to repeatedly over the following years, refining their account and debating what exactly they had witnessed. They did not rush to make their experience public. Both were cautious, knowing that as academics and administrators at Oxford, their reputations could be easily damaged if they were accused of spreading fantastical stories. A decade passed before they finally decided to share what had happened. In 1911, 10 years after their visit, they published their account in a book titled An Adventure. To shield themselves from immediate scrutiny, they used pseudonyms. Charlotte Moberly became Elizabeth Morrison, and Eleanor Jourdain became Frances Lamont. The book described their walk in meticulous detail. It included maps of the gardens, carefully marked with where they encountered each figure. The descriptions of clothing, speech, and bearing were precise, meant to reinforce the seriousness of their claims. Moberly and Jourdain were adamant that they had not stumbled upon a costume pageant or misremembered ordinary visitors. They insisted that the atmosphere itself had changed around them, as if they had stepped into a world suspended in another century. When An Adventure was released, it caused an immediate stir. Readers were fascinated by the idea that two respectable English women of scholarship, discipline, and intellect, claimed to have experienced what many would call a time slip. To believers, it was a groundbreaking account, one of the clearest examples of history bleeding into the present. To skeptics, it was ripe for criticism, yet difficult to dismiss outright because of who the authors were. The use of pseudonyms bought them some time, but when their true identities were revealed, the story became even more sensational. These were not eccentric spiritualists, but the principal and vice principal of St. Hugh's College, Oxford, women with everything to lose by attaching their names to a tale so strange. As soon as an adventure began circulating, debate followed. Some readers accepted the women's account at face value, convinced that they had stumbled into a genuine time slip. Others, however, were quick to point out alternative explanations. If you strip away the uncanny atmosphere and the suggestion of Marie Antoinette herself, was it possible that Moberly and Jourdain had simply misinterpreted what they saw that day? One of the most common skeptical arguments was that the women had encountered ordinary people in costume. Versailles, even in 1901, was not just a museum of stone and gardens. It was a site that often hosted pageants, festivals, and reenactments. Historical dramas were sometimes staged on the grounds, and it wasn't impossible that actors or caretakers dressed in period clothing might have been present. If that were the case, the uniforms, the cloaked figure, and even the sketching woman could have been nothing more than performers, misread as something extraordinary. But there were problems with this theory. Moberly and Jourdain insisted there had been no scheduled events on the day of their visit. They also described the atmosphere itself as shifting in a way that went beyond costumes. The sudden stillness, the muted light, the eerie silence, all of these were details that suggested more than stumbling into a historical pageant. Another explanation put forward was psychological. Folie à deux, or madness of two. This is a rare condition in which two closely connected individuals share the same delusion, reinforcing each other's perceptions until both are convinced of something unreal. Could Moberly and Jourdain have subconsciously influenced one another, shaping their memories into a shared vision of the past? Perhaps one of them initially interpreted the figures as extraordinary, and the other, unwilling to contradict, went along until they both came to believe it. Skeptics also pointed to the passage of time between the event and the publication of an adventure. Memory is a fragile thing, prone to reshaping itself over the years. What the women wrote in 1911 might have been far more elaborate than what they actually experienced in 1901. The maps, the details, even the certainty about Marie Antoinette could have been products of memory reinforced by retelling, rather than accurate descriptions of what occurred. Yet none of these explanations ever fully dispelled the mystery. Even critics admitted there was something unusual about how consistent the women's accounts were, especially given their reputations for seriousness and scholarship. They were not known for fantasy or theatrics. If their story was simply a misinterpretation, why cling to it so firmly, knowing it could undermine their careers? And why publish it at all, unless they truly believed they had stepped, however briefly, into another century? The tension between believers and skeptics has followed the story ever since. Was it a trick of perception, a shared delusion, or an actual glimpse through the veil of time? Each explanation seems plausible on its own, yet incomplete when weighed against the details. That's what makes the Moberly Jourdain incident endure. Not that it can be neatly explained, but that every attempt leaves behind loose threads. Whatever the explanation, the story of Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain refused to fade into obscurity. An adventure was reprinted several times in the early decades of the 20th century, translated into multiple languages, and discussed in both academic and popular circles. The idea that two respectable Oxford women had slipped through time was irresistible to a public already fascinated by ghosts, psychic phenomena, and the blurred boundaries between science and the supernatural. Even those who dismissed the account outright often found themselves unable to stop talking about it. The imagery was part of what made the story so lasting. the woman sketching in the grass, serene yet strangely melancholy. The silent figures in outdated uniforms, the sinister man in the cloak, and above all, the impression that the world itself had shifted, that Versailles, so full of history, had for one strange afternoon reverted to another century. It was a tableau that captured the imagination, and it gave believers something more tangible than whispers of ghosts or vague feelings of dread. Here were two educated women with reputations to protect, putting their names, eventually their real names, on the line to say, "This happened to us." Over time, the Versailles incident became a touchstone in discussions of the paranormal. Writers on psychic research used it as evidence that time itself might not be as rigid as we think. Early parapsychologists argued that what Moberly and Jourdain experienced was not a haunting, but a time slip, a rare phenomenon where the past bleeds into the present. Later, as physics began exploring concepts of relativity and multiple dimensions, some even tried to frame the story as an accidental brush with theories that science had not yet caught up to. It also inspired countless imitators. In the years and decades that followed, reports of time slips appeared in newspapers and magazines, often citing the Versailles story as precedent. RAF pilots during the Second World War claimed to have flown over airfields that looked decades out of date. Shoppers in Liverpool's Bold Street later told of stepping into stores that had closed long before. Each time, the comparison was made, just like Moberly and Jourdain at Versailles. Their walk through the gardens became the prototype, the best-known example of what a time slip might look and feel like. For skeptics, the endurance of the tale said less about the supernatural and more about storytelling. An adventure was compelling because it was detailed, strange, and deeply unsettling. It blurred the line between scholarly testimony and Gothic narrative, making it hard to dismiss entirely. For believers, it has remained a rare case where the witnesses were not fringe voices, but educated women of authority. That credibility gave the Versailles story weight, and it continues to be cited over a century later in books, articles, and documentaries about the mysteries of time. Today, the Petit Trianon remains a popular stop for visitors to Versailles. Most will never experience anything out of the ordinary. Yet, for those who know the story, the walk carries an extra weight. Beneath the manicured lawns and winding paths, there lingers the possibility, however small, that time may not always flow the way we expect. And somewhere in the stillness of those gardens, perhaps the past is waiting, just out of sight, for someone else to stumble into it. That brings us to the end of episode 11 of The Dark Record. We've walked with Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain through the gardens of Versailles and into a century that should have been long gone. Two academics, one strange afternoon, and an account that refuses to fade. Remembered, retold, and now added to the record. Next time, we'll step into one of the most controversial conspiracy legends of the late 20th century: secret experiments, government cover-ups, and rumors of time travel itself. We'll examine the Montauk Project conspiracy. Until then, I'm Lyle Perez, and this has been the Halloween Podcast presenting The Dark Record. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It helps keep the show alive and weird. You can also explore sources, extras, and more at our Facebook page, facebook.com/The Halloween Podcast, or at our website, thehalloweenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening. Stay curious. And remember, sometimes the past isn't as far behind us as we think. Have a good night.